Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Narayanam Namaskritya Naram Jayam Narottam Devim Saraswatim Vyasam Tato Jayam Tire Nashtaprayeshu Treshu Nityam Bhagavata Sevaya Bhagavati Uttam Shloke Bhaktir Bhavati Naistiki. So continuing with our discussion on Sri Chaitanya Charitamrita. Just a second. Madhya Lila, chapter 6. Chapter 6, text 148 onwards. Vedera nigudha artha puja na jaya, Purana vakya sahi artha karaya nishchaya. The confidential meaning of the Vedas is not easily understood by common men. Therefore, that meaning is supplemented by the words of the Puranas. Aho bhagyam, nanda gopa vrajokasam, yan nimitram paramanandam puranam brahma sanatanam. How greatly fortunate Nanda Maharaj, the cowherd man, and all the inhabitants of Brajbhumi. There is no limit to their fortune, because the absolute truth, the source of transcendental bliss, the eternal supreme Brahman, has become their friend. This is quotation from Srimad Bhagavatam. Apani pad shuti varje prakrit pani charanam puna kahe shigra chale kare sarva grihanam. The Vedic Apani Pad mantra rejects material hands and legs. Yet it states that the Lord goes very fast and accepts everything offered to him. Atev Shruti kahe Brahma savishesha mukhya chadi lakshanate mane nirvishesha. All these mantras confirm that the absolute truth is personal, but the Mayavadis, throwing away the direct meaning, interpret the absolute truth as impersonal. Now, this is mentioned in Chaitanya Charitamrita. This is a discussion between Mahaprabhu and Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya. So I'm just reading whatever it is given. Vinay Prabhu might say that they don't say it. Well, we're just going through whatever is given in the scriptures. That's it. As mentioned above, the Shveta Upanishad states, Apani Pado Javano Grahita Pashyati Achakshu Na Shinati Akarana Saveti Vedyam Na Tasyaasti Veta Tam Ahur Agrayam Purusham Mahanta. This Vedic mantra clearly states Purusham Mahanta. The word Purusha means person. In the Bhagavad Gita, Arjuna confirms that this person is Krishna when he addresses Krishna as Purusham Shashvatam. You are the original person. Thus, the Purusham Mahantam mentioned in the words from the Shveta Upanishad is Sri Krishna. His hands and legs are not mundane, but are completely transcendent. However, when he comes, fools take him to be an ordinary person. Krishna himself says, Avajananti mam moda manushim tanum ashitam, Bhagavad Gita. One who has no Vedic knowledge, who has not studied the Vedas from a bona fide spiritual master, does not know Krishna. Therefore, he is a Muda. Such fools take Krishna to be an ordinary person, Param Bhavam Ajananta. They do not actually know what Krishna is. Manushyanam Sahasreshu Kashyat Yatati Siddha. It is not possible to understand Krishna simply by studying the Vedas perfectly. One must have the mercy of a devotee, Yat Padam. Unless one is favored by a devotee, he cannot understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Arjuna also confirms this in Bhagavad Gita. My Lord, it is very difficult to understand your personality. The less intelligent class of men cannot understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead without being favored by his devotee. So, being favored by his devotees, and a devotee can understand Krishna, and then by his Krishna's mercy, he can understand him further. Therefore, Bhagavad Gita contains another injunction: Tad vidhi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya. One has to approach a bona fide spiritual master and surrender to him. Only then can one understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead as a person. So, otherwise, one cannot. Shad Aishwarya Purnananda Vigrah Yahara Hena Bhagwane Tumi Kaha Nirakara. Are you describing as formless that Supreme Personality of Godhead, whose transcendental form is complete with 6 transcendental opulences? So this Mahaprabhu is asking Sarvabhauma Bhattacharya, if the Supreme Personality of Godhead were formless, how could he be said to walk very fast and accept everything offered to him? Rejecting the direct meaning of the Vedic mantras, the Mayavadi philosophers interpret them and try to establish the absolute truth as formless. Actually, the Supreme Lord has an eternal personal form full of all opulence. The Mayavadi philosophers try to interpret the absolute truth as being without potency. However, in the Shveta Upanishad, it is clearly said, Parasya Shaktir Vividhe Vishruyate. The absolute truth has multi-potencies. So they try to interpret, because for them Brahm Jyoti is the supreme. So Brahm Jyoti on its own, it is just devoid of anything, any personality, any variety, any potency. And that's where the major difference is. स्वाभाविक तीन शक्ति यही ब्रह्म है, ब्रह्म है, ने शक्ति करी तारे करा निश्चय. The Supreme Personality of Godhead has 3 primary potencies. Are you trying to prove that he has no potencies? Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu now quotes 4 verses from Vishnu Purana to explain the different potencies of the Lord. विष्णु शक्ति परा प्रोक्ता क्षेत्र ज्ञाख्य तथा परा अविद्या कर्म संज्ञाय तृतीय शक्ति ऋष्यते. The internal potency of the Supreme Lord Vishnu is spiritual, as verified by the Shastras. There is another spiritual potency known as Kshetagya, or the living entity. The third potency, which is known as Nescience, makes the living entity godless and fills him with fruitive activity. So internal potency, spiritual potency, then the Tatastha Shakti, which is Jivas, which are us, and then the Maya Shakti, material potency, and which is also known as nescience or ignorance. So ignorance makes the marginal potency atheist or godless and fills him with fruitive activity. In the Bhagavad Gita, in Shri Krishna's discourse on the Kshetra and Kshetragya, it is clearly stated that the Kshetragya is a living entity who knows his field of activities. The living entities in the material world are forgetful of their eternal relationship with the Supreme Personality of Godhead. This forgetfulness is called avidya or nescience. The avidya Shakti, avidya potency of the material world provokes fruitive activity because we have forgotten. So we are working here and trying to be comfortable in the material. Although this avidya Shakti, material energy or nescience, is also an energy of the Supreme Personality of God, it is especially intended to keep the living entities in a state of forgetfulness. This is due to their rebellious attitude towards the Lord. Thus, although the living entities are constitutionally spiritual, they come under the influence of the potency of nescience. How this happens is explained in the following verse. Yaya kshetragya shakti sa veshtita nripa sarvaga sansara tapan akhilan avapnoti atra sanatana. O king, The Kshetragya Shakti is a living entity. Although he has a facility to live in either the material or spiritual world, he suffers the threefold miseries of material existence because he is influenced by avidya or nescience potency, which covers his constitutional position. So although we have the facility to live, we have the option whether to live in material or spiritual world. But because our consciousness is so much covered, we just forget everything, and we just here Shloka says suffers the threefold miseries, and we think we are happy here. That is more ignorance. We are suffering. Taya tirohitatvacha shakti kshetragya sangita sarva bhuteshu bhupala taratam yena vartate. This living entity, covered by the influence of nations, exists in different forms in the material condition, yes, in different species. O king, he is thus proportionately freed from the influence of material energy to a greater or lesser degree. Okay, the material energy acts on the living entity in different degrees according to how he acquires the association of the three modes of material nature. There are 8.4 million species of life, some inferior, some superior, and some mediocre. The gradations of the bodies are calculated according to the covering of the material energy. So the gradations of the bodies are calculated, means in what species, and that depends on covering of Maya. Or Maya means the three modes of material nature. So depending upon how much we are covered by which mode, we get that form of species of life. In the lower categories, including aquatics, trees, plants, insects, birds, and so forth, the spiritual consciousness is almost non-existent. In the mediocre category, means the human form of life, spiritual consciousness is comparatively awakened. In the superior life forms, spiritual consciousness is fully awakened. Then the living entity understands his real position and tries to escape the influence of the material energy by developing Krishna consciousness. So in this mediocre category, the human form of life, that's a thing we have an option. We can study the scriptures, we can make spiritual progress, or we can live our life, eating, drinking, and be merry. And then depending upon that, we get the next birth, or we live the life of just like animals. And then if we develop that kind of consciousness, then we get next life like that. Haladini sandhani samvit tvayi eka sarva sanshray. Halad tap kari mishra tvayi no guna varjite. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is Satchidananda Vigraha. This means that he originally has three potencies: Sat, Chit, and Anand. The pleasure potency, the potency of eternality, and the potency of knowledge. Together, these are called the Chit potency. And they're present in full in the Supreme Lord. For the living entities who are part and parcel of the Lord, the pleasure potency in the material world is sometimes displeasing and sometimes mixed. But this is not the case with the Supreme Personality of God, because he is not under the influence of the material energy or its modes. So the pleasure potency, or whatever happiness we have in the material world, it sometimes becomes displeasing, and sometimes a mixture of pleasure and not so much of pleasure. Why it becomes displeasing? First of all, pleasure for somebody might not be pleasing us. Somebody might like loud music. We might not like it. Somebody might like pleasure, might have, get pleasure in drinking liquor. Maybe we won't find pleasure in that. So it's different for different, but because it's in different modes of nature. But Supreme Lord is not under the influence of material energy or its modes, and his pleasure is always spiritual. Satchidanandamay hai Ishvara Swarupa, tin ansha chitta shakti hai tin rupa. The Supreme Personality of Godhead in its original form is full of eternity, knowledge, and bliss. The spiritual potency in these three portions, Sat, Chit, and Ananda, assumes three different forms. So, according to the verdict of all Vedic literature, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, the living entity, and the illusory unit, this material world, constitute the subject matter of knowledge. Everyone should try to understand the relationship between them. First of all, one should try to understand the nature of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. From the Shastras, we understand that the nature of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is sum total of eternity, bliss, and knowledge. As stated in verse 154, Vishnu Shakti Paraprokta, the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a reservoir of all potencies, and his potencies are all spiritual. So again, technical knowledge, but understanding is important. Anandanshe haladini, sadanshe sadhini, chid anshe samvit, yare gyan karimani. The three portions of the spiritual potency are called haladini, the bliss portion, sandhini, the eternity portion, and samvit, the knowledge portion. We accept knowledge of these as full knowledge of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. So the three portions of the spiritual energy are called Haladini, Sandhini, and Samvit. To acquire knowledge of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, one must take shelter of the Samvit potency of the Supreme Lord. Samvit means the knowledge portion. Antaranga Chitta Shakti, Tatastha Jiva Shakti, Bahiranga Maya Dine, Kare Prema Bhakti. The spiritual potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead also appears in three phases: internal, marginal, and external. These are all engaged in his devotional service in love. So the spiritual potency of the Lord is manifested in three phases: internal or spiritual, marginal, which consists of living entities, and the external potency known as Maya Shakti. We must understand that in each of these three phases, the original spiritual potencies of pleasure, eternity, and knowledge, Sat, Chit, and Ananda, remain intact. When the potencies of spiritual pleasure and knowledge are both bestowed upon the conditioned souls can escape the clutches of the external potency, Maya, which acts as a cover obscuring one's spiritual identity. So when the potencies of spiritual pleasure and knowledge are both bestowed upon the conditioned souls, the conditioned souls can escape the clutches of Maya. So knowledge that I am part and parcel of Krishna, and Krishna is the Supreme Personality of Godhead, my constitutional position is to serve Krishna with love and devotion, and to engage. And when we engage in that service and service with love and devotion, we experience pleasure, spiritual pleasure. So when these two combined are there, then one can escape the clutches of Maya. We are looking for pleasure, spiritual pleasure, but identifying with the body, we think giving pleasure to the body is a goal of life. And we run around throughout our life, not just this life, millions of lifetimes before, looking for pleasure. And previously it was mentioned pleasure and displeasure. He finds a displeasure in the pleasure and sometimes mixed. So it doesn't really help. Real pleasure is in the spiritual life. So that is when one tastes that, then he doesn't find pleasure in the material world at all. When freed, the living entity awakens to Krishna consciousness and engages in devotion service with love and affection. Shadvida Aishwarya Prabhur Chitta Shakti Vilas, Sena Shakti Nahiman Paramasahas. In his spiritual potency, the Supreme Lord enjoys 6 kinds of opulences. You do not accept this spiritual potency, and this is due to your great impudence. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is full with 6 opulences. All of these potencies are on the transcendental platform. To understand the Supreme Personality of Godhead as impersonal and devoid of potency is to go completely against Vedic information. So 6 potencies in full, not that he has more than anybody else in the material world. No, he has it in full, completely. And not just full, it's always increasing. That's the beauty. Maya Dhisha Maya Vash, Ishvara Jiva Bheda. Hena Jive Ishvara Saha Kahata Abheda. The Lord is a master of the potencies, and the living entity is servant of them. That is the difference between the Lord and the living entity. However, you declare that the Lord and the living entities are one and the same. The Supreme Personality of Godhead is by nature the master of all potencies. By nature, the living entities, being infinitesimal, are always under the influence of the Lord's potencies. Always under the influence, because we are infinitesimal. According to Mundak Upanishad, the Mundak Upanishad completely distinguishes the Lord from the living entities. The living entity is subjected to the reactions of fruitive activity, whereas the Lord simply witnesses such activity and bestows the results. According to the living entity's desires, he is wandering from one body to another and from one planet to another, under the direction of the Supreme Personality of Godhead, Paramatma. So according to our desires, we are wandering. And he, as Paramatma, is only witnessing our activities and sanctioning them also, sanctioning our desires. However, when the living entity comes to his senses by the mercy of the Lord, he is awarded devotional service. Thus, he is saved from the clutches of Maya. At such a time, he can see his eternal friend, the Supreme Personality of Godhead, and becomes free from all lamentation and hankering. This is confirmed in Bhagavad Gita, where the Lord says, Brahma Bhuta Prasannatma na shochati na kamshati. One who is thus transcendently situated at once realizes the Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. He never laments or desires to have anything. Thus it is definitely proved that the Supreme Personality of Godhead is a master of all potencies, and that the living entities are always subjected to these potencies. So that is the difference between Mayadhish and Maya Vash. So he is a master of all potencies. Because also it is like when Bhagavad Gita, Krishna says, Brahma Bhuta Prasannatma na shochati na kamshati. So one who is thus transcendently situated means the living entity who after struggling and after practicing spirituality, he becomes transcendently situated. He at once realizes the Supreme Brahman and becomes fully joyful. So if a living entity can become fully joyful by realizing the Supreme Lord, so how joyful the Supreme Lord must be? He doesn't have to perform yoga to become uh, to realize the Supreme Lord. He doesn't have to do that. He's always supreme. He's always realized. He's always on that platform. We have to get on that platform. So he's Maya Dhish and we are Maya Vash. We are under the influence of Maya. Gita Shastra Jiva Rupa Shakti Kariman Hina Jiva Bhedakara Ishware Rastane. In the Bhagavad Gita, the living entity is established as a marginal potency of the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Yet you say that the living entity is completely different from the Lord. Not completely different. I think they said completely indifferent. Okay, let's see what it is. The Brahma Sutra states that according to the principle of Shakti Matyor Aveda, the living entity is simultaneously one and different from the Supreme Personality of Godhead. Qualitatively, the living entity and the Supreme Lord are one, but in quantity, they are different. So according to Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's philosophy of Achintya Bheda Bhed Tattva, the living entity and the Supreme Lord are accepted as one and different at the same time. Bhumirapo analo vayu kham mano buddhirevacha ahankar ityam me bhinna prakriti rashta. So earth, water, fire, air, ether, mind, intelligence, and false ego are my 8 separated energies. Aparayamitastvanyam prakritim dhime param. Besides these inferior energies, which are material, there is another energy, a spiritual energy, and this is the living being. Mighty Armed One, the entire material world is sustained by the living entities. So they are everywhere. And everywhere, and doing what? Yayedam dharyate jagat. I mean, they're also trying to enjoy this material energy. Ishwarera Shri Vigraha Sachidananda Akara Say Vigraha Kaha Satto Gunera Vikar. The transcendental form of the Supreme Personality of Godhead is complete in eternity, cognizance, and bliss. However, you describe this transcendental form as a product of material goodness. So that's how Shankara Sampradaya is explained. That's called Maya Vag. It's all made of Maya. Shri Vigrayena Mane Say Tapashandi Adrishya Asprishya Hai Say Hai Yamandandi. One who does not accept the transcendental form of the Lord is certainly an agnostic. Such a person should be neither seen nor touched. Indeed, he is subject to be punished by Yamaraj. It's a very heavy statement by Mahaprabhu. So according to Vedic instructions, the Supreme Personality of Godhead has its eternal, transcendental form, which is always blissful and full of knowledge. Impersonalists think that material refers to the forms within our experience, and spiritual refers to an absence of form. However, one should know that beyond this material nature is another nature which is spiritual. Just as there are material forms in this material world, there are spiritual forms in the spiritual world. This is confirmed by all Vedic literature. The spiritual forms in the transcendental world have nothing to do with the negative conception of formlessness. The conclusion is that a person is an agnostic when he does not agree to worship the transcendental form of the Lord. So there is a transcendental form. That's a Krishna. Prabhupada always says, Supreme Personality of Godhead. Actually, at the present moment, all systems of religion deny the worship of the form of the Lord due to ignorance of his transcendental form. The first-class materialists, the Mayavadis, imagine 5 specific forms of the Lord. But when they try to equate the worship of such imaginary forms with bhakti, they are immediately condemned. Lord Shri Krishna confirms this in Bhagavad Gita, where it says, Namam dushkritino moda prapadyante naradham. Bereft of real knowledge due to agnosticism, the Mayavadi philosophers should not even be seen by the devotees of the Lord, nor touched, because these philosophers are liable to be punished by Yamaraj, the superintendent demigod who judges the activities of sinful man. This is what Prabhupada is writing. The Mayavadi agnostics wander within this universe in different species of life due to their non-devotional activities. Such living entities are subjected to the punishments of Yamaraj. Only the devotees who are always engaged in the service of the Lord are exempt from the jurisdiction of Yamaraj. So, heavy statement by Prabhupada, and Prabhupada's statement, he never says, I think, or I feel, or I believe. So basically, it's all based on scriptures. Whatever he says is based on scriptures. So I guess we can stop here and see anybody has any questions or comments.
Hare Krishna, Prabhuji.
Hare Krishna.
Prabhuji, what is superior life? We just studied not three kind of lower life, mediocre life, and a superior life.
The spiritual.
Spiritual is superior.
Yeah.
I think
Spiritual.
superior life. Superior life is a spiritual life.
That's how Prabhupada translated.
Achha, okay. So mediocre life may he, the people who are spiritually advanced, they comes under the superior life.
Yes, yeah.
Okay.
So human beings who are spiritually advanced.
Okay. And second question, Prabhuji, and how come we are called like humans are qualitatively similar to the God?
Qualitatively, because we are part and parcel of God. So the soul, not just human, living entity, every living entity. The soul is Satchidananda. Soul is the quality of soul is Satchitananda. But quantitatively, we are very small.
The quality they're referring to the soul, not to the body.
Yeah, definitely not body. So,
Okay.
Krishna is also made of Satchitananda, and we are also. But the only difference is we are very minute. And I had posted that quotation that a living entity, just us, like jivas, we can, like Krishna is complete, so he has 100%. And it is explained, Vishnu Tattva So Krishna has 64 qualities. That's what scripture say. So Vishnu Tattvas, all Vishnu Tattvas, they only go up to six, they only have 60 qualities. Then Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva has 55. And then Brahma. Brahma is a living entity, so he only has 50. So we can only go up to 50 qualities, not more. That is our perfection. So that also explains we can never become God, and we can never even become equal to Lord Shiva. Lord Shiva is a very, very highly elevated personality. Very, very high. But this is how scriptures have explained. Is it okay?
Yes, thank you, Prabhuji.
Okay, thank you, Mata. Hare Krishna, Jai Shri Prabhupada.
Jai Shri Prabhupada.